It was a freezing winter night in a small southern town. The kind of night where the streets go silent, and even the wind feels tired. Most people were inside, safe and warm. But one man, David Johnson, walked slowly down a dimly lit street, carrying a bag of groceries in one hand and hope in the other. David didn't have much. He lived in a tiny rented house at the edge of town, worked long hours at a repair shop, and still found a way to smile at everyone he met. Life hadn't been easy for him. But kindness? That was something he never ran out of. As he turned the corner, he noticed two small figures huddled under an old bus stop. They looked no older than 10. A boy and a girl, shivering in the cold, wrapped in torn blankets. Their faces were pale, their eyes full of fear. David slowed his steps. "Hey there," he said softly, kneeling beside them. "You kids okay?" The boy hesitated. We don't have anywhere to go." David looked around. No parents, no bags, just two lost children trying to survive the night. He could have walked away. He could have said, "Not my problem." But that wasn't who David was. He took off his coat and wrapped it around them. "Come on," he said gently. "You can stay at my place tonight. It's warm. I've got some soup on the stove." The kids exchanged a nervous look. Then, slowly, they stood up and followed him. As they walked, the little girl whispered, "Why are you helping us?" David smiled. "Because someone once helped me when I had nothing, and I promised I'd do the same someday." That night, in a small, creaky house with chipped paint and a flickering light bulb, a man with almost nothing gave everything he could. He didn't know their names. He didn't know their story. And he definitely didn't know that this one act of kindness would one day save his life. The next morning, sunlight slipped through the cracks of the window, landing softly on two sleeping faces. For the first time in who knows how long, those kids had slept in a real bed, with blankets, warmth, and peace. David quietly brewed coffee in the kitchen, humming to himself. The old wooden floor creaked under his feet, and the smell of toast filled the air. When the kids finally woke up, they looked around, dazed, like they couldn't believe this was real. "Morning," David said with a smile. "I made breakfast. Hope you like pancakes." The boy stared at the plate, hesitant. The little girl whispered, "Are we allowed to eat this?" David chuckled gently. "Of course you are. You're safe here." Slowly they began to eat. Small bites at first, then faster, hungrier. Watching them, David felt something stir inside him. A feeling he hadn't known since his own childhood. Purpose. After breakfast, he asked softly, "What are your names?" The boy spoke first. "I'm Eli, and this is my sister Lena." They told him they had been living on the streets since their parents disappeared, abandoned and forgotten by everyone. They had survived by begging, hiding, and sleeping wherever they could. David listened quietly. Every word hit him deep. He didn't have much money, but what he did have, he was willing to share. That same evening, he cleaned up a small spare room and set up 2 beds with old blankets. "This is yours now," he said, "for as long as you need it." Eli looked at him confused. "Why are you helping us? We're strangers." David smiled. "You're not strangers anymore. You're part of my home." From that day forward, the little house at the end of the street began to feel alive again. David worked during the day and spent evenings teaching the kids simple lessons, reading, writing, and fixing things around the house. They laughed, played, and shared stories. Neighbors started to notice. Some smiled. Others whispered. A few even said behind his back, "A black man raising 2 white kids? That's strange." But David didn't care. He had stopped listening to what the world said long ago. To him, kindness was colorblind. Love was not something divided. It was something shared. Years passed like seasons. Eli and Lena grew stronger, healthier, and brighter. They called him Dad, and he called them his kids. Sometimes when David walked them to school, he'd hear the murmurs, see the stares. But instead of anger, he only felt pride, because he knew his life finally had meaning. At night, as he sat by the window watching them sleep, he whispered to himself, "Maybe this is what I was born to do." He didn't realize it then, But the love he was giving, the warmth he poured into their hearts, would come back to him someday, in ways he could never imagine. Years slipped by like pages turning in a book. Eli and Lena were now teenagers, smart, kind, and full of dreams. David watched them grow with pride, his heart swelling every time he heard them call him Dad. But life has a cruel way of testing even the purest souls. One rainy evening, David was walking home from work, his jacket soaked, boots muddy from the downpour. The streetlights flickered as thunder rolled in the distance. He passed by the corner store, the one he'd gone to for years, when suddenly police cars came screeching to a halt. "Hands where I can see them," a voice shouted. Startled, David raised his hands instantly. "What's going on?" he asked, confused. Officers rushed toward him, guns drawn. Within seconds, he was surrounded. The store owner, a man David had known for years, stood nearby, terrified. Behind him, the shattered glass door swung open in the wind. "There's been a robbery," one of the officers barked. "You fit the description." David's heart pounded. "What? I just got off work. I didn't do anything." But no one listened. The more he tried to explain, the harsher their tone became. They forced him to the ground, cold rain hitting his face as handcuffs clicked around his wrists. People from the neighborhood gathered, whispering, recording, watching. Among them, a few familiar faces. Neighbors who had seen David raise two white kids with love and patience. But now all they saw was another black man in handcuffs. At the station, the questions were endless, the accusations sharper than knives. "Where were you between 8 and 9? Why were you near the store? How do you explain the timing?" David tried to stay calm. "I was walking home. I didn't steal anything. Please check the cameras." But in that moment, no one cared about truth. They cared about closing a case. The store owner couldn't identify the suspect clearly, but that didn't matter either. The only thing that seemed to matter was that David fit the profile. Hours later, as he sat alone in a cold interrogation room, the weight of the world pressed down on his chest. He thought about Eli and Lena, his kids. What would they think? Would they be scared? Would they even know where he was? Tears burned his eyes. "God," he whispered, "I did everything right. Why is this happening?" When the door finally opened, the officer didn't even look at him. "You're being charged with armed robbery and manslaughter," he said flatly. David's heart sank. "Manslaughter? Someone died?" The officer gave no answer. That night, David was booked, fingerprinted, and thrown into a cell. His world shattered, his name stained. Somewhere across town, two grown-up children, his children, were living their own lives, far away, unaware that the man who once saved them now needed saving himself. Weeks turned into months, and David's world became a blur of gray walls and sleepless nights. He sat behind cold iron bars, staring through the tiny window that let in a sliver of sunlight, the only reminder that the world outside still existed. He had never been in trouble before. He'd never even gotten a speeding ticket. Yet now, he was being called a criminal, a killer. The police report claimed that during a robbery at the convenience store, the clerk had been shot. The suspect, described as a black male in dark clothing, was seen fleeing the scene. David fit that vague description, and that was enough. No fingerprints, no weapon, no witnesses. Just assumptions, just skin color. When his court date finally came, David walked in wearing an old over. The courtroom fell silent. David's knees nearly gave out. The judge's voice echoed through his skull. "Life in prison without the possibility of parole." Life. A single word that took away everything. He looked around the courtroom, hoping to see one familiar face, one person who believed him. There was no one. As the guards led him away, he whispered under his breath, "Lord, give me strength." Not for freedom, but for faith. In prison, time lost its meaning. Days bled into nights, nights into years. At first, David was angry. Angry at the world, the police, the judge, even at God. But slowly he began to let go of hate. He started helping others instead, teaching young inmates how to read and write, counseling those on the verge of giving up. His calmness became known in every corner of the prison. They began calling him preacher, not because he was a saint, but because he gave people hope in a place where hope didn't belong. Still, every night when the lights went out, he'd close his eyes and whisper two names: Eli, Lena. He wondered what had become of them. Did they remember him? Were they safe? He'd saved them once, from the cold, from hunger, from loneliness. Now he prayed that, wherever they were living the life he'd always wanted for them. But destiny wasn't done with David Johnson. Somewhere, hundreds of miles away, a story was about to resurface. One that would make the world remember him not as a criminal, but as the man who once saved two forgotten children. And when those children, now grown, strong, and successful, finally discovered the truth about the man who raised them, everything would change. 20 years. 2 long decades had passed since that night when the world turned its back on David Johnson. Inside those prison walls, he had aged gracefully, his hair grayer, his voice calmer, his faith stronger. The world outside had changed, but David's heart stayed the same. He still prayed every night for Eli and Lena, the 2 children who once called him Dad. Meanwhile, far beyond those gray walls, Eli had become a successful attorney. His face was often on TV, defending clients, fighting for justice, and standing up for the wrongly accused. Lena, his sister, had grown into a social worker, helping children find homes. Perhaps because deep down, she remembered what it felt like to be lost and found. They never spoke about their childhood much. It was a pain they'd tucked away, like an old photograph in a drawer. All they knew was that they'd been adopted by another family after their foster father disappeared. But one night, fate intervened. Lena was scrolling through social media when she stumbled upon a viral post. It read, "Inmate Preacher Johnson, serving life without parole for a crime he says he didn't commit. Known for mentoring inmates and spreading hope inside prison walls." Attached was a picture. An older man sitting in a prison library reading a book with a gentle smile. Lena froze. Her hands trembled. That face, those eyes, they were unmistakable. "Eli," she whispered over the phone, voice shaking. "I think I found him." When Eli opened the link, his heart stopped. It was him. David. The man who had fed them, clothed them, loved them when the world ignored them. The man who used to tuck them in and say, "You are not defined by where you came from, but by where you're going." Eli's throat tightened. "How could this be?" he muttered. "How could he be in prison all these years? And we never knew?" They spent the entire night digging through court records, news archives, and old police reports. And the deeper they went, the more they realized nothing made sense. No fingerprints, no witnesses, no weapon. Just a description that matched thousands of innocent men. Lena's voice cracked. "They took everything from him because of what he looked like." Eli clenched his fist. "Then we'll give him back everything they stole." Days later, they drove to the prison. The long road seemed endless, every mile filled with guilt and anticipation. When David walked into the visitation room, his eyes widened in disbelief. 2 grown adults stood there, a man in a suit and a woman with tears in her eyes. "Mr. Johnson?" Lena whispered. David's voice shook. "No one's called me that in 20 years." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Lena stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. "It's us. Eli and Lena." The room fell silent except for the sound of sobbing. David covered his face with his trembling hands. "My babies, my babies." They embraced across the table, a moment that years of pain could not erase. Eli looked him in the eye. "We found out everything. You were innocent. You shouldn't have been here." David smiled softly. "Life isn't always fair, son, but love makes it worth living." Lena gripped his hand. "We're not leaving you here. Not again." Over the next few weeks, Eli used every resource he had. He reopened the case, tracked down witnesses, and requested access to the original evidence. And that's when he found it. A missing piece of surveillance footage that had never been shown in court. It clearly showed another man leaving the store seconds after the robbery. A man who looked nothing like David. Eli's team worked day and night. They gathered statements, filed appeals, and pushed the story into the media spotlight. Soon, the world began to take notice. Justice for David started trending. News outlets picked up the story of the black man who raised two white kids, and those kids who now fought to free him. David's story became a symbol of hope, love, and redemption. Letters poured in from around the world, people inspired by his strength, his forgiveness, his grace. Eli stood before the court weeks later, his voice firm but emotional. "Your Honor," he said, "you convicted the wrong man." But he never lost faith. Not in God, not in justice, and not in us. "My sister and I are here because of him. And now, we're here for him." The courtroom fell silent. The judge leaned forward, reviewing the new evidence. David sat quietly in his orange jumpsuit, tears glistening in his eyes. For the first time in 2 decades, hope felt real again. The courtroom was silent, but the air was electric, filled with anticipation, hope, and the weight of years stolen. David Johnson sat quietly, his hands clasped together on the table. He had grown older, wiser, and yet, in this moment, he felt the nervous flutter of a man stepping into freedom he had long believed impossible. Eli and Lena stood beside him, their hands tightly gripping each other's. Their eyes never left him. For them, he wasn't just a man accused of a crime. He was the person who had given them love, guidance, and a home when no one else would. The judge cleared his throat and addressed the courtroom. "We have reviewed the new evidence provided by Mr. Eli Johnson and Ms. Lena Johnson, including surveillance footage and witness testimony that was not previously presented. This court finds that David Johnson was wrongfully convicted." A collective gasp filled the room. David's heart pounded in his chest. For 20 years he had endured injustice, humiliation, and confinement. And now, the world was finally acknowledging the truth. Eli stepped forward. "Your Honor, this man raised us when no one else would. He showed us the meaning of love, respect, and integrity. We are here today not just to clear his name, but to honor the life he lived for us, and countless others." The judge nodded solemnly. "David Johnson is hereby released from custody. He will face no further charges in this matter." At those words, the room seemed to explode in emotion. David's knees nearly buckled as Eli and Lena pulled him into a hug. Tears streamed down all 3 faces. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. News cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and the world watched as a man who had given everything to others finally received justice. David stepped onto the steps, breathing deeply the air of freedom. He looked at Eli and Lena and smiled through his tears. "I never helped you for this," he said softly. "I only did what I felt was right. And seeing you here, seeing that you turned out to be good people, that is all the reward I ever wanted." The grown children hugged him again, holding on as if to make up for the 20 years lost. Passers-by stopped, some wiping their own tears, inspired by a story of pure, selfless love prevailing over injustice. Over the next days, the story went viral. Black man who raised 2 homeless white kids finally freed after 20 years. The world celebrated David not only for his survival, but for the life he gave to others despite facing unimaginable adversity. David returned home with Eli and Lena, the little house at the edge of town, the same place where he had welcomed 2 frightened children so long ago, felt alive again. Laughter filled the rooms, tears mingled with smiles, and love reclaimed the space that injustice had once tried to destroy. He didn't celebrate the courtroom drama, nor did he hold anger toward those who had wronged him. Instead, he shared a simple message with everyone he met. Love. Help others when they need it. Do what is right, even if no one notices. The world has a way of returning what we give. And for David, that world finally returned what he had given all those years ago. Hope, justice, and a life restored. The story of David Johnson's freedom spread like wildfire. Within days, news outlets across the country covered it. Man who raised 2 homeless children wrongfully imprisoned for 20 years is finally free. Black hero saved 2 lives. Now the world celebrates his courage and kindness. Social media erupted. Hashtags like Justice for David and Kindness Wins trended worldwide. Millions of people were inspired by the story of a man who, despite facing unimaginable injustice, never lost faith in love and humanity. David returned home to the small house at the edge of town, the same house that had once been a refuge for Eli and Lena. The door creaked open, and for the first time in 20 years, it felt like a home again. Eli and Lena stood beside him, their eyes shining with tears and pride. "You're home, Dad," Lena whispered, hugging him tightly. David smiled, the lines of hardship on his face softening. "Home, yes, and this time, I'll never leave it alone." Neighbors who had once doubted him now came forward, offering congratulations and apologies. People from around the world sent letters, gifts, and messages, thanking David for showing that true kindness knows no boundaries, no color, no prejudice. He didn't seek fame. He didn't crave recognition. For David, the reward had always been the lives he touched, Eli and Lena. Yet the world had finally recognized him, and the recognition was not just for his suffering, but for his heart, his courage, and his unwavering integrity. Over the next few weeks, David began speaking publicly about his experience. In interviews, he said, "I never helped Eli and Lena to be remembered. I helped them because it was the right thing to do. And if my story inspires even one person to act with kindness, then everything I went through has meaning." Eli and Lena worked tirelessly to make sure David's story reached as many people as possible. The narrative of love, injustice, and redemption resonated across communities, inspiring debates, conversations, and acts of generosity everywhere. Schools invited David to speak. Charities featured his story. Social media influencers shared the tale, each one emphasizing a simple truth. One act of kindness can ripple through generations. And David? He finally had peace. He spent his days with Eli and Lena, helping children in need, mentoring the youth, and showing the world that courage is not only about surviving injustice, but also about continuing to love and do good despite it. The world had tried to break David Johnson, but he had endured. The children he once saved had returned the favor, and together, they showed the world that love, integrity, and courage are stronger than fear, hatred, or injustice. Years later, the story of David Johnson was no longer just a news headline. It had become a symbol. Schools taught children about his courage. Community centers displayed posters of his message. Love knows no color. Justice knows no delay. Kindness changes lives. Eli and Lena had grown even more successful, but they never forgot the lessons they learned in that small house at the edge of town. They used their influence and wealth to build programs for children in need, the homeless, the abandoned, the overlooked. Every center had a small plaque, in honor of David Johnson, who taught us that one act of love can change the world. David spent his days traveling quietly, visiting shelters, speaking at conferences, and mentoring young people. His story was shared at universities, in prisons, and across social media. Each time he spoke, he reminded people, "You never know the ripple effect of your actions. One small kindness can come back to you in ways you cannot imagine." People began to call it the Johnson effect, a movement sparked by the man who gave everything to two lost children, and, in return, had his own life saved by their love and courage. Documentaries were made, interviews recorded, and books written about his journey. Yet David remained humble. He refused to profit from his story. Instead, he used the attention to highlight ongoing issues: injustice, systemic bias, and the struggles of children without homes. Even 25 years later, Eli and Lena would sit with him in the same living room where it all began. They would laugh, cry, and reminisce. David would smile, looking at them, saying, "I did what I could, and you grew into incredible human beings. That's all the reward I'll ever need." The world, however, had not forgotten. Letters continued to pour in, from teachers, lawyers, and ordinary people inspired by his unwavering faith in humanity. Some shared stories of their own kindnesses. feeding a stranger, adopting a child, defending someone wrongfully accused. David's story proved that true courage isn't about seeking recognition. It's about acting with integrity, even when the world looks the other way. He had endured decades of injustice, survived imprisonment, and yet emerged with a heart stronger than ever. As he watched Eli and Lena help the next generation, David realized something profound. The kindness he had given, the love he had poured into two children had multiplied. It wasn't just about freeing him from prison anymore. It was about creating a legacy of compassion that would endure for generations. And every time someone shared his story online, typed respect in the comments, or acted to help a stranger in need, David knew his life, all the struggles, the pain, and the love, had not been in vain. Because the most powerful truth he had learned over a lifetime remained. Love given freely always comes back. If you believe that love and kindness create legacies that last forever, type legacy in the comments. Share this story with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe for more real-life tales of courage, love, and triumph.